In the vast, open spaces of the American Southwest, there is a sound that is not a sound at all, but a feeling. It is the heavy, patient silence of the high desert, a silence so profound it seems to have a weight of its own, pressing down on the mesas and filtering into the arroyos. This story does not begin with a gunfight or a dramatic stagecoach robbery, but with a more persistent and common presence in that land, a railroad. The year is 1905. The place is a small, unremarkable water stop called Agua Fría, New Mexico Territory, located on the main line of the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway. There are no mountains of gold here, no bustling saloons. There is only the station, a water tower, a section foreman's house, and the general store that also serves as the post office. The population fluctuates between 12 and 15 souls, depending on whether the section gang is hiring. Our focus will be on the life of one of those souls, a man whose entire existence is measured by the arrival and departure of trains, and by the slow, steady accumulation of tasks required to keep the rails safe for their passage. This is the story of Thomas Cady, the section foreman, and his long, unremarkable days. It is a story of crossties and rail spikes, of creosote and caliche, of the grinding rhythm of handcars and the dependable cycle of the sun. It is a story designed to be as uneventful as a long stretch of desert track, and hopefully, just the thing to guide you gently towards sleep. Thomas Cady's day began not with a rooster, for there were none in Agua Fría, but with the distant, low moan of a locomotive whistle, still miles to the east. The sound would seep into his small, adobe house, wrapping itself around the thick walls before the first pale light touched the top of the distant Ortiz Mountains. He would lie still for a moment, his eyes open in the darkness, listening. It was the number 7, the westbound passenger, running on time as it always did. He could tell by the pitch, a sound he had heard thousands of mornings before. It was a more reliable alarm clock than any manufactured device. He would swing his legs out of the narrow iron bed, his bare feet landing on the cold, packed earth floor. The air in the room was sharp and dry, carrying the faint, acrid smell of the creosote soap ties stacked behind the house. His wife, Mary, would stir slightly on her side of the bed but not wake. Theirs was a marriage of quiet companionship and shared silence, comfortable in its predictability. Cady would dress in the dark by feel, heavy wool trousers, a long-sleeved cotton shirt, thick socks, and his worn leather-work boots. He would run a hand over his bristled jaw, deciding that shaving could wait another day. In the small kitchen, he would light a kerosene lamp, the flame a small, steady beacon in the pre-dawn gloom. He would fill the graniteware coffee pot with water from the bucket on the counter and set it on the cast-iron stove. While it heated, he would sit at the simple wooden table and eat a cold biscuit left from supper, chewing slowly, his mind already moving through the tasks of the day. The coffee would boil, and he would pour himself a thick mug, the brew black and strong enough to hold a spoon upright. He would drink it standing by the window, watching the eastern sky transform from black to a deep, bruised purple, and then to a pale, watery blue. The stars, brilliant just an hour ago, would fade one by one. He would see the silhouette of the water tower against the lightning sky, a simple wooden structure on stilts, its long spout poised over the tracks like the bill of a great, sleeping bird. This was his domain. After finishing his coffee, he would rinse the cup and place it in the dry sink. He would take his worn felt hat from a peg by the door and step outside. The air was bracingly cold, a sharp contrast to the day's coming heat. He could smell the dry dust of the desert, the faint mineral scent of the distant mountains, and always, that underlying, pervasive odor of creosote. He would walk the short distance to the tool shed, his boots crunching on the hard-packed gravel. He would unlock the heavy padlock with a key he kept on a rawhide string around his neck and slide the door open with a grinding sound. Inside, the tools were arranged with a meticulous order that would satisfy any military mind. Shovels, picks, and tamping bars hung from nails on the walls. In the corner stood the section handcar, a four-wheeled vehicle with a seesaw handle, ready to be pumped onto the tracks. Cady would select a track wrench, a heavy steel bar with a hooked jaw, and a spike maul, its iron head worn smooth and shiny from years of use. He would carry them back to the house and lean them against the wall by the front door, ready for the day's work. By now, the sun's first rays would be striking the top of the water tower, painting it a warm gold. He would see a plume of smoke in the east, marking the approach of the number 7. He would stand and watch, a solitary figure in the vast landscape, as the locomotive grew from a speck to a chugging, steam-belching behemoth. The ground would begin to vibrate, a low hum that traveled up through the soles of his boots. The engine would roar past, a blur of driving rods and hissing steam, pulling a string of gleaming passenger cars. Through the windows he could see the blurred shapes of passengers, their world one of speed and destination, utterly alien to his own. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the train was gone, the sound receding, the silence slowly settling back over Agua Fría like a blanket. The day could truly begin. By the time the sun had fully cleared the horizon, Cady's crew would begin to arrive. They lived in a small collection of jackals, crude huts made of upright poles and mud, a half-mile down the track. First would come Pablo Griego, a man of about Cady's age, with a deeply lined face the color of saddle leather. He was the most experienced hand, having worked the rails since he was a boy. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, never wasting emotion. He carried his own lunch pail, a battered tin bucket, and he nodded silently to Cady as he approached. Then would come the 2 younger men, brothers from a Mexican village further south, whose names Cady always had to think about for a moment. They were Jesus and Maria, though everyone called the younger one Cheto for his flat, broad face. They were strong and willing but spoke little English, communicating with Cady and Pablo through a combination of simple Spanish, hand signals, and shared understanding of the work. Today, they were accompanied by a new man, a tall, thin Anglo with hollow cheeks and eyes that darted around nervously. He said his name was Whiteley and that he needed work. Cady looked him over. The man's hands were soft, uncalloused. "Ever swing a maul?" Cady asked. Whiteley shook his head. "Ever tamp ties?" Another head shake. Cady grunted. "You'll learn. You walk the line with us today. You watch. You pick up what we drop. Pay is $2 for a 10-hour day. You start, you finish. No questions." Whiteley nodded eagerly, a look of slight relief on his face. The crew gathered by the tool shed. Cady assigned the tasks for the morning. They would be walking the section, a stretch of track 3 miles to the east, inspecting for any faults. Pablo would carry the track wrench. The brothers would carry shovels and a tamping bar. Whiteley was handed a 5-gallon canvas water bag and told to keep it filled from the barrel by the station. Cady himself carried his spike maul, a tool he felt more comfortable with than any other. They didn't take the handcar. For a simple inspection, walking the line was better. It allowed you to feel the track under your feet, to see the small details. They set off in single file along the edge of the right-of-way, the crushed rock ballast crunching under their boots. The sun was climbing now, and the cool of the morning was already beginning to burn off. To their left, the tracks ran straight as a string into the shimmering distance, converging to a single point on the horizon. To their right, the desert stretched out, a seemingly endless expanse of sagebrush, creosote bushes, and prickly pear cactus. Cady led the way, his eyes scanning the track with the focus of a hawk. He looked at the rails, searching for any sign of a flaw, a slight fracture in the iron. He looked at the spikes, making sure they were seated firmly in the ties, holding the rail fast. He looked at the angle bars, the heavy iron plates bolted together to join the rails end to end. He would occasionally stop and kneel down, placing his hand on the rail, feeling for any vibration that might indicate a loose joint. Pablo, a few paces behind, would do the same, his eyes following Cady's gaze. "See here," Cady said after they had walked about a mile. He pointed to a spike that had worked its way up a fraction of an inch. "Sun and the cold. They breathe, these rails. They pushed the spikes up. He didn't do anything about it, just noted it in his mind. That was a job for the handcar and a full crew later. A slightly high spike wasn't an emergency. It was just a thing to be fixed. They walked on in silence, the only sounds the rhythmic crunch of their boots and the distant buzz of an unseen insect. Whiteley struggled to keep up, his city shoes slipping on the loose ballast. He drank frequently from the water bag, a fact that Cady noted with a slight frown. The desert would teach the man, one way or another. Around mid-morning, they came to a long, gentle curve in the track, following the base of a low mesa. Here, Cady stopped. He pointed to a section of track about 50 feet long. "Look there, Pablo." Pablo nodded. The alignment was slightly off. To an untrained eye, it would look perfectly straight, but both men could see that the rail had a barely perceptible wiggle, a slight deviation from the true line. It was a sun kink in the making, or the result of heavy trains gradually pushing the track out of place. "We'll need to line it," Cady said. Lining track was a precise and laborious job. It would involve loosening the spikes, using lining bars to shift the heavy rails inch by inch back into their proper position, and then respiking them. It was a job for the afternoon, after they had finished the inspection. They continued, marking other small faults in their minds, a cluster of loose spikes here, a tie that was beginning to rot there, a spot where the ballast had washed away from under a tie after a rare, hard rain a month ago. Cady carried the map of his section in his head, a detailed inventory of every minor imperfection. The railroad demanded perfection, but the reality of maintaining it was a constant, losing battle against entropy. The job was not to achieve perfection, but to manage the decline, to keep the imperfections small enough that they wouldn't derail 1,000 tons of speeding locomotive. They reached the 3-mile point, a small, rusted metal marker bolted to a tie. This was the end of their section. Beyond this, it was the responsibility of the next foreman, a man Cady saw perhaps once a month at a divisional meeting in Lamy. They sat down on the ballast in the narrow strip of shade cast by the marker. The sun was now high and hot. Pablo produced a bundle of tortillas and some dried meat from his pocket. The brothers shared a single piece of bread. Cady ate another cold biscuit. He passed the water bag around, allowing each man a short drink. Whiteley drank long, and Cady had to gently pull the bag from his hands. "Easy," he said. "Long way back." They rested for exactly 20 minutes, by Cady's internal clock. Then, without a word, he stood up, and the others followed. The walk back was always different. The sun was behind them now, but the heat radiating from the metal rails and the ballast was intense. They walked on the west side of the track, using the slight shadow cast by the train cars that weren't there. They moved a little slower, the morning's energy sapped by the heat. They passed the same spots, noting them again, but from the opposite perspective. When they finally arrived back at the tool shed in Agua Fría, the sun was past its zenith. The station agent, a man named Ellerby who wore a green eyeshade even in the deepest shade, was standing on the platform, sorting a small pile of mail. He raised a hand in lazy greeting. Cady nodded back. The crew put away their tools, all except the lining bars, which they would need shortly. Mary had left a plate for him on the kitchen table, a thick slice of cold cornbread and a piece of salt pork between 2 slices of bread. He ate standing up, washing it down with dipper of water from the bucket. Through the window, he could see his crew reassembling by the tool shed, sitting in whatever shade they could find, waiting for him. He took off his hat and wiped the sweat from his brow with his sleeve. He put his hat back on and walked out the door. The afternoon's work was about to begin. The handcar was a simple machine, but it required coordination. Cady and Pablo took the handles on one side, Jesus and Maria on the other. Chato was stronger than his brother and set a steady rhythm. Whiteley was told to stand on the platform in the middle and hold the tools. "Pump when I say," Cady instructed. They lifted the car, slid it onto the tracks, and Cady gave the nod. and pump. They leaned into the handles, pushing down in unison, and the car lurched forward, its steel wheels singing a high-pitched song on the rails. The pumping was rhythmic work. Down, push, up, step. Down, push, up, step. The car would coast between pumps. They built up a steady speed, the wind from their movement providing a small relief from the afternoon heat. The desert slid by in a slow, bumpy panorama. Cady guided them, not with words, but with slight shifts of his weight. They reached the curve they had marked that morning and Cady raised his hand. Easy, stop. The pumping ceased, and the car coasted to a halt, its brakes squeaking as Cady applied the lever. The work of lining track was slow and required a delicate feel. Cady walked the curve, sighting down the rail, squatting to get his eye low to the ground. He marked the ties where the rail was worst with small piles of ballast. "We start here," he said, pointing. "Pablo, you and me on the bar. Jesus, you start pulling spikes on this side. Chato, you follow us, ready to tamp." The men took their positions. Cady and Pablo inserted the pointed end of a long lining bar under the base of the rail, bracing it against a tie. On Cady's grunt, they heaved together, using the bar as a lever to try and move the massive rail sideways. It barely budged, if at all. They reset the bar a few inches further along and heaved again. This was the heart of the work, a series of tiny, almost imperceptible movements, repeated hundreds of times. Jesus followed, using a claw bar to pull up the spikes that held the rail to the ties on the inside of the curve, freeing the rail to move. Chato stood ready with his tamping bar, waiting to pack ballast under any ties that had been lifted by the movement. The sun beat down on their backs. Sweat soaked through Cady's shirt, plastering it to his skin. The only sounds were the clink of the lining bar against the rail, the groan of the metal as it was stressed, the solid thunk of the spike maul, and the heavy breathing of the men. Whiteley stood uselessly to the side, holding the water bag, until Cady sent him to gather more rocks to use as temporary braces. Inch by inch, they worked their way down the curve. Cady would sight the rail, call for another heave, and the men would obey. It was a conversation between the foreman and the track, with the crew acting as the interpreters. After an hour, they had moved perhaps 100 feet of rail a quarter of an inch. After 2 hours, they had made it to the end of the bad section. Cady walked back to the beginning and sighted down the rail again. The wiggle was gone. The line was true. He allowed himself a small nod of satisfaction. With the rail lined, the next task was to replace the spikes and retamp the ties. This was even more tedious. Jesus and Maria moved back down the line, driving the spikes they had pulled back into the ties. A spike had to be driven with just the right force, hard enough to hold the rail securely, but not so hard that you split the wooden tie or bent the spike. Each one required 3 or 4 solid blows from a maul. Thud, thud, thud. The sound was a steady, rhythmic heartbeat along the tracks. Meanwhile, Cady and Pablo took the tamping bars. A tamping bar was a long, heavy iron rod with a flat, chisel-like end. The job was to pack the crushed rock ballast firmly under the ties, providing a solid, stable bed for the track. You would slide the bar under the tie, then ram it down repeatedly, forcing the small rocks into the gaps. It was back-breaking work, requiring you to bend over for hours at a time. The vibrations from the bar would travel up through your arms and into your shoulders, leaving them aching by the end of the day. Cady worked with a steady, practiced rhythm. Slide, ram, ram, ram. Slide, ram, ram, ram. He didn't think about the work. He let his body take over, his mind drifting. He thought about the cool water in the barrel by the house. He thought about the smell of Mary's cooking, which he would soon be close enough to the house to smell on the evening breeze. He thought about nothing at all, letting the repetitive motion and the intense heat lull him into a kind of waking trance. Whiteley, trying to make himself useful, attempted to help. He grabbed a tamping bar and jammed it under a tie. He pushed down, but instead of packing the rocks, he just shoved the bar deeper, disturbing the ballast. Cady watched him for a moment, then walked over. He gently took the bar from Whiteley's hands. "Not push," he said, his voice low and even. "Ram. You pack it down, you don't dig it up." He demonstrated again, the bar moving in short, sharp strokes. Whiteley tried again, his efforts clumsy but marginally better. He would learn, or he would leave. Most left. The sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, the shadows lengthening across the desert floor. The heat began to ease, replaced by the softer warmth of late afternoon. They had been working on the curve for over 4 hours. The job was nearly done. Cady stood up straight, his back protesting, and surveyed their work. The track looked good. It looked strong and true. He walked to the handcar and returned with a small can of oil and a rag. He knelt down and carefully oiled the moving parts of the angle bars at the rail joints. It was a small thing, but it prevented rust and kept the joints from seizing. It was the kind of detail that separated a good section foreman from a mediocre one. As the sun touched the top of the Ortiz Mountains, turning them a brilliant shade of orange and purple, Cady called an end to the work. The men gathered their tools, loading them onto the handcar. They were all exhausted, their faces streaked with dust and sweat. The ride back to Agua Fría was quiet, the pumping slow and weary. No one spoke. They just watched the station grow larger in the fading light. They slid the handcar off the tracks and back into the shed. The tools were cleaned of dust and hung in their proper places. Cady paid the men from a small leather pouch he kept in the shed. $2 silver for each of the regulars, one for Whiteley, who had only worked half a day. Whiteley took the coin, looked at it, and slipped it into his pocket without a word. He would be gone by morning, Cady knew. The desert was not for everyone. The brothers trudged off toward their jackals. Pablo gave Cady a silent nod and walked away into the dusk. Cady stood alone by the shed for a moment, listening. The silence was profound. Then, from far to the west, he heard it, the faint, mournful whistle of the number 8, the eastbound passenger. It was running on time, just like the number 7 that morning. The day was complete. He walked back to his house. The lamp was lit in the kitchen, a warm glow in the window. He opened the door and stepped inside. Mary was at the stove, stirring a pot of beans. The smell filled the small room, rich and comforting. She turned and looked at him, her face showing no particular expression. "Supper's ready," she said. He nodded. "Good." He hung his hat on the peg, took off his dusty boots, and set them by the door. He went to the washstand in the corner and poured water from a pitcher into a basin. He splashed his face and hands, the water shockingly cold. He dried himself on a rough linen towel. He then sat down at the table, and Mary placed a bowl of beans, a piece of salt pork, and a fresh biscuit in front of him. They ate in silence, the only sound the clink of their spoons against the tin bowls. After supper, Cady sat in his wooden rocking chair by the unlit fireplace. He didn't read, for he owned no books but the Bible, which he only opened on Sundays. He didn't smoke. He simply sat, his hands resting on his thighs, his eyes looking at nothing in particular. He listened to the crackle of the fire in the stove and the soft rustle of Mary as she cleaned the dishes. This was his hour of rest. His mind replayed the day's work, checking off the tasks. The inspection, the lining, the tamping. All done. Tomorrow, there would be more. A different section of track, different small faults to correct. It would be much the same. When the last of the light was gone from the sky, Cady got up, blew out the lamp, and went to bed. Mary was already asleep. He lay on his back, staring into the darkness of the ceiling. The house was silent. Then, the sound came. The distant moan of a whistle. The number 4, the fast freight, barreling through the night. The sound grew louder, the ground beginning to tremble. He could hear the engine now, the rhythmic chugging building to a roar. The house would shake slightly, a plate rattling in the dry sink. Then, as quickly as it came, the roar would fade, swallowed by the vast desert night. The silence would return, deeper than before. He listened to it fade, his thoughts drifting with the sound. He closed his eyes, and sleep took him, a sleep as deep and featureless as the landscape outside. The next morning began exactly as the one before. The distant moan of the number 7, the cold darkness, the creak of the bed, the feel of the packed earth floor under his feet. Thomas Cady dressed in the dark, his hands finding his clothes by memory. In the kitchen, he lit the lamp, its small flame pushing back the gloom just enough to see the outlines of the familiar room. He ate a cold biscuit, standing by the window, watching the east turn from black to purple. He drank his coffee, black and thick, and watched the silhouette of the water tower take shape against the lightning sky. But this morning, when he stepped outside, the air held a different quality. It was not just cold, it had a bite to it, a sharpness that spoke of the high altitude and the changing season. A thin skin of ice had formed on the surface of the water barrel by the corner of the house. He broke it with the side of his hand, the ice cracking with a sound like thin glass, and dipped the bucket in for the day's water. The creosote smell from the stacked ties seemed sharper in the cold air, more pungent. He walked to the tool shed, his breath misting in front of his face. He unlocked the heavy padlock and slid the door open. The tools were where he had left them, hanging in their precise order. He selected his tools for the day, the spike maul, a track wrench, and a small pry bar. He also took down a heavy canvas tarpaulin, folded and stored on a high shelf. The forecast, if you could call it that in a place with no telegraph for weather reports, was in the sky. There was a high, thin haze, and the stars had seemed unusually bright just before dawn. It meant a cold front was moving in. There might be snow by afternoon. The tarpaulin would be needed to cover the handcars' workings if they got caught out on the line. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, pale and watery behind the haze, his crew began to arrive. Pablo came first, his leathery face seeming even more weathered in the harsh morning light. He wore a heavy wool poncho over his usual clothes, a garment that looked as old and worn as he was. He nodded to Cady, his eyes taking in the tarpaulin draped over Cady's arm. He grunted, a sound that conveyed both understanding and agreement. The brothers, Jesus and Maria, arrived together, walking fast and swinging their arms to keep warm. They wore thin jackets, inadequate for the cold, and their faces were pinched. Behind them came a new man, not Whiteley, but another. This one was short and stocky, with a round, impassive face and dark eyes that seemed to take in everything without appearing to look at anything. He was an Indian, Cady thought, possibly Navajo from further west, or maybe from one of the pueblos along the Rio Grande. He wore a flat-crowned felt hat and a blanket coat. He said his name was Santiago. He spoke no English, but when Cady pointed to the tools and then to the handcar, Santiago walked over and began helping the brothers load it without being asked. He moved with a quiet efficiency that Cady appreciated immediately. The day's task was to replace a stretch of worn rail about a quarter-mile east of the station. The rail there was old, its head worn thin by countless wheels, and the district supervisor had marked it for replacement on his last visit. A pile of new, 60-pound rail lay on a siding a mile further east, left there by a work train the week before. Their job was to get the new rail and bring it back, piece by piece. They loaded the handcar with the tools they would need, spike mauls, track wrenches, claw bars, and lining bars. Cady also made sure they had a good supply of rail spikes in a heavy canvas bag. He pointed to the tarpaulin, and Santiago folded it and placed it on the car without being told. They lifted the car onto the tracks and set off, pumping in a steady rhythm. The cold wind bit at their faces as the car picked up speed. The pumping kept their bodies warm, but their fingers and toes grew numb. The landscape slid by, muted under the gray, hazy sky. The colors of the desert, usually so vivid, were dulled to shades of brown and gray. The distant mountains were barely visible, their outlines smudged into the sky. Cady's eyes, as always, scanned the track ahead. He noted a place where a cluster of spikes seemed slightly high, a spot where a tie was beginning to split. He filed them away in his memory for another day. They reached the siding where the new rail was stacked. It lay in neat piles beside the track, long, dark lengths of iron, each one 30 feet long and weighing nearly a ton. They were coated with a thin film of rust, but underneath, the metal was strong and true. Getting them onto the handcar was the first challenge. The handcar was not designed to carry such a load. They would have to move the rail in pieces, one length at a time, with the car making multiple trips. Cady directed the men. They used lining bars as levers to pry one rail off the top of the pile. It slid to the ground with a heavy, grinding thud that shook the earth. They then had to maneuver it so that one end rested on the handcar's platform and the other end was supported by a small, two-wheeled dolly they had brought along, called a push truck. It was a delicate and dangerous operation. A 30-foot rail is an unwieldy thing, and if it shifted unexpectedly, it could crush a man's leg or foot. Pablo and Santiago worked the bars at one end, while Cady and the brothers worked at the other. They lifted, grunting with the effort, and slid the rail forward a few inches at a time. Poco a poco, Pablo would mutter. Little by little. It was the only way. After what felt like an hour, they had the rail balanced, its front end on the handcar, its back end on the push truck, which was now coupled to the handcar with a length of heavy chain. The handcar itself sagged under the weight. Cady surveyed the rig. It would hold. It would have to. Slow, he said to the men, his voice carrying in the cold air. Very slow. And steady. No sudden moves. They took their positions at the pump handles. The weight was immense. When they pushed down on the handles, the car barely moved. They had to throw their entire body weight into each pump, a deep, groaning effort that seemed to come from their very core. The car inched forward, the wheels complaining with a high-pitched squeal. The journey back was a study in slow, painful progress. Each pump was a battle. The muscles in Cady's shoulders and back screamed in protest. Beside him, Pablo's face was a mask of concentration and strain. The brothers pumped with grim determination, and Santiago, on his first day, matched them effort for effort, his round face betraying nothing but focus. The cold was forgotten in the heat of the labor. Sweat poured down their faces, despite the freezing temperature. They moved at a walking pace, maybe slower. The push truck behind them wobbled precariously, the rail swaying slightly with each pump. Cady kept his eyes fixed on the track ahead, willing the car forward, praying that a wheel wouldn't slip off the rail under the immense strain. The station at Agua Fría seemed impossibly far away. They passed familiar landmarks, a particular clump of cholla cactus, a weathered wooden sign that had once marked something, a dry wash where flash floods sometimes raged. Each one marked a small victory, another few yards gained. After an hour of this grueling work, they had covered less than half the distance. Cady could feel his strength flagging. He looked at the others. They were all exhausted, their faces drawn and pale. He knew they couldn't make it all the way in one push. They would have to rest. He signaled for them to stop. They ceased pumping, and the car rolled to a halt. The sudden silence was immense, broken only by their heavy, ragged breathing. They stood by the car, leaning on the handles, their chests heaving. The cold air seared their lungs. Cady passed around the water bag. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. They were only halfway home, with a massive weight to move in an afternoon that was growing colder and grayer by the minute. The high, thin haze had thickened, and the sun was now a mere smudge of lighter gray in the sky. A few tiny, almost imperceptible flakes of snow began to drift down, swirling in the still air. Cady looked at the sky, then at the rail, then at his men. He made a decision. "We leave it," he said. "We come back tomorrow." The men looked at him, then at the rail. Pablo nodded slowly. It was the right call. Trying to push on in the snow, with exhausted men, was a recipe for disaster. The rail would be safe where it was. No one was going to steal a 30-foot steel rail. They detached the push truck from the handcar, leaving the rail balanced on it, chalked in place with large rocks. They turned the handcar around, a much easier task without the weight, and began the pump back to Agua Fría. The journey, which had taken an hour of agonizing effort on the way out, took less than 20 minutes on the way back. The handcar fairly flew along the track, the men pumping with a lightness that felt almost giddy after the crushing weight they had just been moving. The snow continued to fall, tiny, dry flakes that did not stick to the ground but swirled around them like dust. They arrived back at the station as the light began to fade. The snow had stopped, leaving only a dampness in the air. They put the handcar away and stored the tools. Cady paid the men their wages, including Santiago, who took the $2 silver, looked at them, and tucked them into a fold of his blanket coat. He nodded once to Cady and then walked off into the dusk toward the jackals. He hadn't spoken a single word all day. Cady walked home, his body aching with a deep, bone-tired weariness. He opened the door to the warm kitchen. Mary was there, as always. She took one look at him and wordlessly pointed to the chair by the stove. He sat, and she brought him a cup of hot coffee, stronger even than his morning brew. He wrapped his cold hands around the warm tin cup and let the heat seep into his fingers. He didn't tell her about the day, about the struggle with the rail, about the snow. There was no need. The story was written in his slumped shoulders and the grime on his clothes. She understood. Supper that night was a thick stew of mutton and potatoes, the kind of meal that stuck to your ribs and warmed you from the inside. He ate slowly, savoring each bite. After supper, he did not sit in his rocking chair. Instead, he went straight to bed, falling asleep almost before his head touched the pillow. He did not hear the whistle of the number 4 that night. He slept the sleep of the utterly exhausted, a sleep without dreams. The next morning, the world was white. A light dusting of snow covered everything, transforming the familiar landscape into something strange and new. The water tower stood out against the white ground like a dark sentinel. The tracks were 2 dark lines running through the whiteness, the snow already beginning to melt off the steel. Cady stood on his doorstep, looking at it. It was beautiful, in a stark, unforgiving way. But beauty was a luxury. He had work to do. That rail wasn't going to move itself. He ate his breakfast, drank his coffee, and went to the tool shed. His crew was waiting for him. Pablo was there, wrapped in his poncho. The brothers were there, stamping their feet to keep warm. And Santiago was there, his blanket coat dusted with snow, his round face as impassive as ever. They loaded the handcar again, this time with a heavier chain and a few more blocks of wood to use as levers. They set off down the track, the wheels of the handcar leaving 2 dark lines in the thin snow. The air was cold and clean, and the sky was a pale, cloudless blue. It was going to be a good day for moving rail. They reached the stranded rail in less time than the day before. It sat where they had left it, still balanced on the push truck, the rock still holding it in place. A light coating of snow dusted its top. They set to work immediately. The cold had made the metal even more unyielding, but it had also hardened the ground, making it easier to maneuver the push truck. Cady devised a new plan. Instead of trying to pump the handcar with the rail attached, they would use the handcar to pull the push truck, but they would also have 2 men walk alongside, using lining bars to help guide the trailing end of the rail and keep it from catching on the ties. It was slow, tedious work. Santiago and one of the brothers walked beside the rail, their bars inserted under it, ready to lift or push if it began to drift. Cady, Pablo, and the other brother pumped the handcar. The weight was still immense, but with the guides, the progress was steadier. They moved at a crawl, but they moved. The sun climbed higher, melting the snow from the tracks and the ballast. Water dripped from the ends of the ties. The men stripped off their jackets and ponchos, working in their shirt sleeves despite the lingering chill in the air. By mid-morning, they had reached the point where the old rail was to be replaced. Cady called a halt. Now came the next part of the job, removing the old rail. This was a job that required precision. You couldn't just rip up the old rail. You had to unbolt it from its neighbors, pull the spikes that held it, and then carefully slide it out from under the angle bars. Cady directed the men. Pablo and Santiago worked on the spikes at one end, using claw bars to pry them out of the ties with a great groaning of wood. Cady and the brothers worked on the bolts at the joints, using heavy wrenches to loosen the nuts. The bolts were often rusted and stubborn, requiring a blast of kerosene from a small can Cady carried and many hard turns of the wrench. One by one, the spikes came out. One by one, the nuts were loosened. The old rail was now free, lying in its chairs on the ties, held in place only by its own immense weight. Now, Cady said, "We lift." They took their positions along the 30-foot length of rail, 3 men on each side, their hands gripping the cool iron. And, lift. They heaved, their backs straining, and the rail came free of the chairs. It was incredibly heavy. They staggered under the weight, but they held it. "Walk." Cady grunted. They shuffled sideways, carrying the rail clear of the track bed and dropping it with a final, ground-shaking thud onto the ballast beside the right-of-way. It lay there, a piece of scrap, waiting for a work train to eventually come and collect it. The crew stood for a moment, catching their breath. Then, without pause, they turned to the new rail. They rolled it off the push truck and onto the waiting chairs. This was just as difficult as removing the old one, but in reverse. They had to maneuver the heavy rail into position, its ends lining up perfectly with the rails to which it would be joined. It required a lot of heaving and prying with lining bars, a lot of sighting down the track to ensure the alignment was true. Cady was the final judge. He would squat down at one end, sighting along the rail's edge, and call out adjustments. A hair to the left at this end. Good. Now the other end, forward just a fraction. Stop. It was painstaking work. Once the rail was seated in the chairs, the real work began. The spikes had to be driven back in, pinning the rail to the ties. This was a job for the mauls. Thud, thud, thud. The sound echoed across the desert, a steady, rhythmic counterpoint to the vast silence. Santiago proved to be a master with a maul. He didn't swing wildly like some men. His swing was short, powerful, and perfectly accurate. Each blow landed square on the head of the spike, driving it home with a minimum of wasted motion. He could drive a spike in 3 blows where other men needed 5 or 6. Then came the bolting of the joints. The angle bars had to be fitted on each side of the rail ends, and the long bolts threaded through and tightened. This required a team of 2, 1 on each side of the rail, turning their wrenches in unison. Cady worked with Pablo on the first joint, while the brothers worked on the other. The nuts had to be drawn up tight, but not too tight. There was a specific tension required, a feel that came only with experience. The sun was past its zenith by the time the new rail was fully installed. The crew was exhausted, but the job was done. Cady walked the length of the new rail, inspecting every spike, every bolt. He knelt and felt the joints. They were smooth and true. He stood up and allowed himself a rare smile. "Good work," he said. It was perhaps the most effusive praise he had ever given. The men looked at him, then at each other. A small, quiet sense of satisfaction settled over them. They gathered their tools and loaded them onto the handcar. The push truck, now empty, was coupled behind. The ride back to Agua Fría was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the exhausted silence of the day before. It was the quiet of a job well and truly finished. The sun was warm on their backs. The snow was gone, as if it had never been. The desert had returned to its usual shades of brown and gray. When they reached the station, the agent, Ellerby, was on the platform. He was talking to a man in a suit, a man Cady didn't recognize. The man was holding a leather satchel and a rolled-up piece of paper. Ellerby pointed to Cady as the crew unloaded the tools. The man in the suit walked over, picking his way carefully across the ballast in his city shoes. He was a thin, pale man with wire-rimmed glasses and a nervous, bird-like way of moving. "Mr. Cady?" he asked. Cady nodded. "My name is Penrose. I'm from the Divisional Engineer's office in Albuquerque." He extended a hand, and Cady shook it, his own hand rough and calloused against the man's soft, clean palm. "I'm here to survey the new right-of-way. The proposed cutoff." Cady had heard rumors of a cutoff, a new line that would bypass the long loop through Lamy and shorten the run to the coast by nearly 50 miles. It was just talk, he had thought. Rumors that drifted along the rails like smoke. Penrose unrolled his paper. It was a large map, covered with lines and markings. He pointed to a spot on it. "We're looking at a route that would go through here, about 10 miles south of your section. It would cross the San Pedro River and then follow the old stagecoach road." Cady looked at the map. It showed the country he knew, but in a strange, abstract way. He saw the familiar names: Ortiz Mountains, San Pedro River, the town of Cerrillos. But the new line, drawn in red ink, cut through them in a way he had never imagined. "Your section will remain in service, of course," Penrose continued, his voice a little too bright. "For local traffic. But the main line, the transcontinental traffic, that will all go on the new cutoff. It's a more efficient grade. Faster running times. Less wear and tear on the locomotives." He rolled the map back up. "I'll be out here for a few days, taking levels, running sight lines. I'll need a handcar and maybe a man to help with the equipment. Mr. Ellerby said you could spare someone." Cady looked at his crew. Pablo was leaning against the tool shed, his eyes on the stranger. Santiago was coiling a rope, paying no attention. The brothers were waiting to be paid. "Santiago," Cady said. The man looked up. "You go with this man. Help him. He'll tell you what to do." Santiago nodded, his face as impassive as ever. He walked over to Penrose, who looked slightly taken aback by the silent, blanket-coated figure. Cady paid the other men. As they dispersed, he stood by the tool shed, watching Penrose spread his maps on the station platform and point out across the desert to the south. Santiago stood beside him, listening. Cady felt a strange, unfamiliar feeling. It wasn't worry, exactly. It was more like a faint tremor, like the first vibration of a distant train. The world was changing. A new line was being built. He had spent his entire adult life maintaining this one, this ribbon of iron that ran past his door. And now, it seemed, it was to become a branch line, a backwater. The main current of American commerce, the thundering transcontinental trains, would bypass Agua Fría entirely. He walked home slowly. Mary was in the yard, hanging laundry on a line strung between the house and a stout post. The white sheets flapped in the dry breeze. She looked up as he approached. "Supper's not ready," she said. He nodded. "That's fine." He sat on the bench by the front door, taking off his hat and running his hand through his thinning hair. She continued with her work, pinning a shirt to the line with wooden pegs. After a few minutes, she spoke without turning around. "Who was the man?" "Engineer. From Albuquerque. They're building a new line. A cutoff. To the south." He said it flatly, as if reporting the price of beans at the general store. Mary stopped, a wet sock in her hand. She turned to look at him. "A new line?" He nodded. "Our trains? The fast ones? They'll go on the new line." She absorbed this information silently. Then she turned back to her laundry. "Well," she said, her voice carrying on the breeze. "The sun'll still rise. The beans'll still need cooking." Cady sat for a long time on the bench, watching her work. She was right, of course. The sun would still rise. The number 7 and the number 8 would still run, at least for a while. His crew would still need to tamp ties and drive spikes. The section would still need a foreman. But something had shifted. A small crack had appeared in the edifice of his predictable world. The track he maintained, which he had always thought of as the center of things, was about to become the edge. That evening, after supper, he didn't sit in his rocker. Instead, he walked out to the tracks. The sun had set, and the sky was a deep, luminous purple. The rails glowed with the last of the light, two perfect, parallel lines stretching into the gathering darkness. He walked along them for a short distance, his feet finding the ties by memory. He stopped and listened. There was no train coming. There was only the vast, patient silence of the desert. He reached down and touched the rail. It was cool to the touch, the day's heat already gone. He thought about the thousands of trains that had passed over this very spot, carrying people and goods, hopes and dreams. He thought about the men who had laid this rail, who had sweated and strained just as he and his crew had done that very day. He was a part of that long chain, a link in a story that was bigger than himself. He turned and walked back to his house. The lamp was lit in the kitchen window. He went inside, closed the door, and the night settled over Agua Fría, deep and silent and full of stars. The surveyors stayed for a week. Each morning, Santiago would appear at the tool shed, collect the handcar with Penrose, and they would pump southward, disappearing into the vast landscape. Each evening, they would return, Penrose covered in dust and looking exhausted, his maps now covered in a dense web of pencil marks. Santiago would help him load his equipment, take his $2 silver, and vanish into the dusk without a word. He never spoke to Cady about the work, and Cady never asked. It was not his concern. But the presence of the surveyors changed the atmosphere in Agua Fría. The agent, LRB, had more telegrams to send and receive. A few times, a special car would be attached to a passing train, and important-looking men in suits would step onto the platform, stretch their legs, and consult with Penrose. They would point to the south, talk in low voices, and then climb back aboard their private car and be carried away. They never looked at Cady or his crew. They were men from a different world, a world of maps and timetables and corporate profits, a world that had nothing to do with bent spikes and rotten ties. The routine of the section crew continued, but it felt different. The urgency had gone out of it. There were fewer trains, and the ones that did come were slower, older engines pulling shorter consists. The great, roaring transcontinental flyers, the pride of the Santa Fe, had all been rerouted. The trains that now passed through Agua Fría were locals, hauling agricultural goods from the small farming communities to the east, or hauling empty cars back to the division point for reassignment. The whistle of the number 7, once a clarion call that started Cady's day, now sounded almost mournful, a lonely cry in the vast desert. One evening, about a month after Penrose had departed, Cady was sitting on his bench after supper. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Mary came out and sat beside him, a rare occurrence. She usually had mending or some other task to occupy her hands until the light failed. But tonight, she just sat, her hands folded in her lap, looking out at the same view he had looked at for decades. "The water tower," she said, after a long silence. He followed her gaze. The wooden structure, once a proud symbol of the railroad's reach, was showing its age. Several of the supporting timbers had a gray, weathered look, and one of the cross braces had sagged noticeably. No train had taken water from it in months. The big spout, once poised and ready, now hung limp and unused, like a broken arm. "I noticed," Cady said. "Should come down, probably. Before it falls down." Mary nodded slowly. "The railroad won't pay to fix it. Not anymore." He knew she was right. The water tower was a relic, a piece of infrastructure that had outlived its purpose. Like him, perhaps. The thought came unbidden, and he pushed it away. The next day, he mentioned the water tower to Ellerby. The agent looked up from his telegraph key, his green eyeshade casting a strange shadow on his face. "Water tower," he said. "Oh, that. I got a wire from the division last week. They're not going to maintain it anymore. Said it's our responsibility now, if we want to keep it. The town's, I mean." He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Town. What town?" 12 people and a pile of rocks. He went back to his key, the clicking filling the small station. Cady walked back to his crew. They were waiting by the tool shed, ready for the day's work. He looked at them, Pablo, solid and reliable, the brothers, Jesus and Maria, who had become steady hands, and a new man, a young Mexican named Tomas who had replaced Santiago. They were a good crew. They looked to him for direction. He gave it. "Today," he said, "we walk the line. All the way to the east marker. We check every joint, every spike. We take our time." It was a task that would fill the day, but it was also a task that would keep them busy, keep them from thinking about the slow decay that was settling over their world. They walked the line, just as they had done hundreds of times before. The sun was warm, the sky was blue, and the desert was its usual, unchanging self. They found the usual small faults, a few loose spikes, a couple of angle bars that needed oiling, a tie that was beginning to split. They noted them, and Cady assigned them for the coming days. But the work felt different. It felt like maintenance for the sake of maintenance, not for the sake of something greater. They were no longer keeping the King's Highway in repair. They were just tidying up a back road. At midday, they stopped in the shade of a large juniper tree that grew beside the track, a rare occurrence in this high desert. They ate their lunches in silence. Pablo, who had been even quieter than usual for weeks, finally spoke. "My son," he said, his voice raspy. "He works on the new line. He is a Gandhi dancer. They pay him $3 a day." He said it without looking at anyone, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. Cady nodded slowly. He had heard the rumors. The new line was paying better wages, drawing men away from the old sections. It was inevitable. After lunch, they continued their inspection. They reached the 3-mile marker, turned, and walked back. The afternoon sun beat down on them, and the walk seemed longer than usual. When they finally reached Agua Fría, Cady's feet ached and his back was stiff. He was getting old. He had to admit it to himself. The work that had once been second nature was now a physical struggle. That evening, he soaked his feet in a basin of cool water while Mary read aloud from an old newspaper that had been used to wrap something from the general store. She read slowly, stumbling over the longer words. It was an article about a new horseless carriage that could travel at the astonishing speed of 20 miles per hour. It seemed impossible, a machine that could outrun a train. He listened, but the words didn't really register. He was thinking about Pablo's son, earning $3 a day on the new line. He was thinking about his own $2, which had seemed like a fair wage for so long. He was thinking about the water tower, slowly rotting in the desert sun. The next morning, Pablo was not at the tool shed. Cady waited, but he did not come. He sent Tomas to the jackals to look for him. Tomas returned alone. "He is gone," he said. "His things are gone. He left in the night." Cady absorbed this information silently. He had expected it, ever since Pablo had spoken of his son. But the reality of it was a blow. Pablo had been with him for over 15 years. He was more than a worker, he was a companion in the silence, a man who understood the work without needing words. Now he was gone, lured away by the promise of a higher wage on the new line. Cady looked at the remaining crew, the two brothers and the young Thomas. They were good men, but they were not Pablo. They did not have his eye for the track, his steady hand with a lining bar, his deep, wordless knowledge of the rails. The day's work stretched out before him, and for the first time in years, he felt daunted by it. The weeks that followed were difficult. Without Pablo, the work went slower. Cady had to explain tasks that Pablo would have anticipated, had to check work that Pablo would have done perfectly. The brothers did their best, and Thomas was eager to learn, but the rhythm of the crew was broken. They were like a handcar with a missing pump handle. They could still move, but not with the same smooth, efficient power. The railroad, as expected, did nothing about the water tower. It stood there, a decaying monument to a busier time. Cady noticed that the general store had fewer customers. The agent, LRB, spent most of his days sitting on the platform, staring into space, with nothing to do but wait for the occasional telegram. The trains that did pass through were so infrequent that the schedule became a matter of guesswork. You might hear a whistle once a day, or you might go 2 days without seeing a single plume of smoke on the horizon. One afternoon, a work train came through. It was a short consist, a single locomotive, a flat car loaded with rails, and a caboose. It stopped at Agua Fría, the first train to stop in months. A man in overalls jumped down from the caboose and walked over to Cady, who was working on a loose joint near the station. "You Cady?" the man asked. Cady nodded. The man handed him a folded piece of paper. "Orders," he said. He turned and walked back to the train. A few minutes later, the locomotive whistled, and the work train chugged off to the east. Cady unfolded the paper. It was a single sheet, typed, with the Santa Fe letterhead at the top. He read it slowly, his lips moving slightly. It was from the division superintendent. It informed him that, due to the reduction in traffic on the Agua Fría branch line, his section was being reclassified. Effective immediately, he was no longer a section foreman. He was now a trackwalker. His crew was being disbanded. He would be responsible for the maintenance of the entire 20-mile branch line by himself, with the assistance of occasional work trains as needed. His pay would be adjusted accordingly. He read it again, then a third time. The words didn't change. He folded the paper carefully and put it in his pocket. He looked up. The brothers were watching him from a short distance away, their faces questioning. Thomas was holding a tamping bar, waiting for instructions. Cady walked over to them. He didn't know how to say it. He had never had to fire a man before. Men came and went on their own, but he had never had to tell them there was no more work. "The railroad," he began, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "They're changing things. There's no more crew. Just me." He looked at their faces, seeing the confusion, then the slow dawning of understanding. "I'm sorry," he said. It was all he could think to say. Jesus, the older brother, stepped forward. He held out his hand. Cady shook it. "Gracias, Patron," Jesus said. "For everything." His brother did the same. Thomas just nodded, his young face troubled. They gathered their few personal belongings from the tool shed and walked away down the track, toward the jackals that would soon be empty. Cady watched them go. When they were just small figures in the distance, he turned and looked at the tool shed, at the handcar, at the tracks. He was alone. That evening, he told Mary. She was kneading dough for bread, her hands white with flour. She stopped when he spoke, but she didn't turn around. She listened as he read her the letter. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment. Then she resumed her kneading, her hands moving with the same steady rhythm as before. "Well," she said, her voice flat. "We have the garden. And the chickens. And I can take in mending from the store, maybe." She didn't say anything about the pay cut, about the loneliness of his new job, about what it meant for their future. She didn't need to. They both understood. The next morning, Cady went to the tool shed alone. He unlocked the padlock and slid the door open. The tools were all there, hanging in their precise order. He looked at the handcar. He would have to learn to pump it by himself, or walk the line. At his age, walking 20 miles was not possible. He would have to manage the handcar alone, a slow and awkward process. He selected his tools for the day: a track wrench, a spike maul, a small can of oil, and a water bag. He loaded them onto the handcar, then struggled to lift it onto the tracks by himself. It took 3 attempts, his muscles straining, before he finally got it positioned. He began to pump. Without a partner, it was exhausting. He would push down on one handle, then rush to the other side and push down on the other, the car lurching forward in a series of jerky movements. He made slow progress, his breath coming in short gasps. By the time he had gone a mile, he was drenched in sweat and his arms were trembling with fatigue. This was impossible. He couldn't maintain the line like this. He stopped the car and sat on the edge of the platform, looking back toward Agua Fría. The station was a small speck in the distance. The water tower, even from here, looked crooked. He thought about the letter, about the division superintendent who had never even met him, who had made this decision based on columns of numbers on a piece of paper. He thought about Pablo, working on the new line, probably making good money. He thought about his own 2 hands, worn and aching, and the endless miles of track that stretched out before him. He sat there for a long time, until the sun had climbed higher and the heat began to press down on him. Then he got up, turned the handcar around with great effort, and pumped his way slowly, painfully, back to the station. He put the handcar away, hung up the unused tools, and walked home. He sat on the bench by the front door and didn't move for the rest of the day. Mary brought him water, and then later, a plate of food. He ate without tasting it. He was trying to figure out what to do. He had spent his entire adult life serving the railroad. The railroad had just informed him that his service was no longer required, not really. He was a caretaker now, a janitor for a stretch of track that no one cared about. Days turned into weeks. Cady developed a new routine. He no longer tried to pump the handcar. Instead, he walked. He would rise at dawn, pack a lunch, and walk east along the track, inspecting as he went. He would go as far as he could, usually 2 or 3 miles, then turn around and walk back. The next day, he would walk west. In this way, over the course of a week, he could cover the entire 20-mile branch line. It was slow, inefficient, and his feet and knees ached constantly, but it was the only way. The work itself changed. He no longer attempted major repairs. He couldn't. Lining a curve or replacing a rail required a crew. He could only do the small things: tighten a loose nut with his wrench, drive a single spike that had worked its way up, oil a squeaky joint. He became a palliative caretaker, not a maintainer. He was simply trying to slow the rate of decay, not stop it. One day, while walking west, he came upon a place where a small rockslide had covered the track. It was not a big slide, just a pile of stones and gravel that had tumbled down from a low cut. A train could probably push through it, but it would be risky. He stood and looked at it. A few years ago, he would have called his crew, and they would have had it cleared in an hour. Now, he had only himself. He took off his coat, picked up a large rock, and carried it to the side of the track. Then he picked up another. And another. He worked all afternoon, under the hot sun, moving the rocks one by one. By the time the sun began to sink, he had cleared a path wide enough for a train to pass. He was exhausted, his hands raw and bleeding, but the track was clear. It was a small victory, but it was the only kind he could manage now. He walked home in the dusk, his body screaming with pain. He passed the water tower, which now leaned at an even more precarious angle. He passed the station, dark and silent. He passed the general store, which had closed a month ago. He reached his house. The lamp was lit in the kitchen. Mary was waiting. He opened the door and stepped inside. The warmth enveloped him, the smell of cooking enveloped him. He sat down at the table, and she put a bowl of stew in front of him. He ate slowly, his raw hands hurting with every movement of the spoon. He did not tell her about the rock slide. She did not ask. The silence between them had deepened, becoming something vast and impenetrable, like the desert itself. Winter came to Agua Fría. It was not a harsh winter by northern standards, but for the high desert, it was cold enough. The nights were bitter, with temperatures dropping well below freezing. The days were short and often gray. Cady's walks became shorter. He could not stay out as long in the cold. His old bones ached, and his fingers grew numb even through his thick gloves. He would walk a mile or two, then turn back, the track stretching out before him, empty and forlorn. One morning, he woke to a world of white. A heavy snow had fallen during the night, blanketing everything in a deep, silent layer. He stood at his window, looking out. The tracks were invisible, buried under the snow. There was no point in going out today. There was nothing he could do. He sat by the stove, drinking coffee, listening to the wind. Mary was mending a shirt, her needle moving in and out of the fabric with a soft, rhythmic sound. They sat like that for most of the day, not speaking, just existing in the warm, small space of their kitchen. The snow did not last. 2 days later, the sun returned, and the snow melted, turning the desert into a muddy, sloshy mess. Cady resumed his walks, but the going was slow and treacherous. The ballast was slippery, and he had to watch his footing. He was more aware than ever of his own fragility. A fall, a broken bone, and that would be the end. There was no one to come looking for him. Mary would worry, but she couldn't come and find him. He would just lie there, by the tracks, until he died or until a train came, whichever was sooner. He thought about this a lot as he walked. He thought about death, about the end of things. He had never been a man for deep thoughts, but the solitude of his new existence forced him into them. He thought about the men he had worked with, the ones who had come and gone. He thought about Pablo, who he had heard was now a foreman on the new line, a promotion. Good for Pablo. He thought about Santiago, the silent Indian, who had probably moved on to some other job, some other place. He thought about his own life, measured out in ties and spikes, in cups of coffee and cold biscuits, in the distant moan of train whistles. Had it been a good life? He didn't know how to answer that. It had been his life. That was all. One afternoon, he was walking east when he heard a sound. It was a sound he had not heard in months, the whistle of a locomotive. He stopped and listened. It was coming from the east, and it was close. He stepped off the track and waited. Around the bend came a train, but it was not like any train he had seen before. It was a single locomotive, pulling a string of weathered boxcars, but the boxcars were old, their paint faded, their lettering barely legible. And on the flat car behind the tender was a strange contraption, a large, metal-sided building on wheels, with windows and a stovepipe sticking out of the roof. It was a railroad construction camp, mobile, the kind used by extra gangs working far from any town. The locomotive chugged past him, the engineer giving a short wave. Then the strange building on wheels passed, and he could see men inside, sitting at a table, playing cards. They didn't look out. The train continued west, toward Agua Fría. Cady watched it go, a feeling of unease settling over him. What was a construction camp doing on his branch line? There was nothing to construct. There was only decay. He hurried his walk back, his old legs moving as fast as they could. It took him over 2 hours to reach the station. When he did, he found the strange train sitting on the siding, the one that hadn't been used in years. Men were climbing down from the cars, stretching their legs. A man in a clean shirt and a derby hat was standing on the platform, talking to Ellerby, who looked more animated than he had in months. Cady approached. The man in the derby hat saw him and walked over. "You Cady? The track walker?" His voice was brisk, efficient. Cady nodded. "Good. I'm Henderson, from the division engineer's office. We're here to pull up the track." Cady stared at him. "Pull up the track?" The words didn't make sense. "That's right. The branch line is being abandoned. The rails will be taken up and used elsewhere. The land will be sold. We'll start at the western end tomorrow and work our way back. Your services will no longer be required after today." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "This is your final pay and a letter of separation. The railroad thanks you for your many years of service." Cady took the paper. He looked at it, but the words blurred before his eyes. He looked up at the train, at the men who were now unloading tools, spike pullers, rail tongs, wrecking bars. They were not builders, they were destroyers. They had come to erase his life's work, to turn the tracks he had maintained for so long into so much scrap iron. He walked home in a daze. Mary was in the kitchen. He handed her the paper. She read it, her face unreadable. When she finished, she looked up at him. "So," she said. "It's done." He nodded. He sat down at the table. He felt empty, hollowed out. The thing that had defined his existence for over 30 years was being taken away. He was not just losing a job, he was losing his place in the world. That night, they did not speak of it. They ate their supper in silence. They went to bed in silence. Cady lay awake for a long time, listening. He listened for the whistle of a train, but there was none. The silence was absolute. It was the silence of a world without the railroad, a world he did not know how to live in. The next morning, he woke at his usual time. The room was dark. He started to get up, then stopped. He had nowhere to go. He lay back down. Mary was still asleep. He stared at the ceiling, watching the first pale light creep across it. He heard sounds from outside, the clanking of metal, the shouts of men. The crew was already at work, pulling up the track. He did not go to the window to watch. He could not bear to see it. Part 23. He stayed in bed until Mary got up. She moved around the room, dressing, going to the kitchen. He heard her light the stove, put the coffee pot on. The familiar sounds of morning, but now they felt strange, disconnected. He finally got up, dressed, and went into the kitchen. She had a plate of biscuits on the table. He sat down and ate one. It tasted like dust. He spent the day sitting on the bench by the front door. He watched the activity down by the tracks. He could see the men working, see the rails being lifted, see the ties being stacked. The sounds carried on the still air, the grinding of machinery, the crash of metal, the occasional shout. It was like watching his own funeral from a distance. Towards evening, the work stopped for the day. The men climbed back onto their strange train. A locomotive came from the west and coupled on. With a long, mournful whistle, the train began to move, pulling the construction camp and a string of flat cars now loaded with old rails and ties. It moved slowly past his house. He could see the men on the flat cars, sitting on the piles of scrap, smoking cigarettes, laughing. They passed, and then the train was gone, disappearing around the curve to the east. The silence it left behind was deeper than any he had ever known. He looked at the tracks. Or rather, he looked at where the tracks had been. For a stretch of several hundred yards to the west, the rails were gone. Only the bare ties remained, lying on the ballast like the ribs of some great, dead creature. The following day, the train would return, and the men would continue their work, methodically erasing the line mile by mile. He watched them for 3 days. Each day, the bare stretch grew longer. Each day, the train would come, load up, and depart. Each evening, the silence would grow deeper. On the 4th day, he did not go to the bench. He could not watch anymore. He stayed inside, helping Mary with small tasks, things he had never done before. He patched a hole in the wall with mud. He sharpened the blades of her scissors on a small whetstone. He did these things mechanically, his mind elsewhere. On the 5th day, there was a knock at the door. It was Henderson, the man from the engineer's office. He held his derby hat in his hands. "Mr. Cady," he said, "we're at the edge of your property. We'll be taking up the track that runs past your house tomorrow. I just wanted to let you know. After that, the nearest rail will be 3 miles east. The line will be gone." Cady nodded. Henderson hesitated, as if he wanted to say something more, but then he just nodded back, put his hat on, and walked away. That night, Cady and Mary sat at the kitchen table for a long time after supper. The lamp burned low. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. The world they had known was being dismantled, piece by piece, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The next morning, Cady went out to the bench one last time. He wanted to see it. He wanted to witness the end. The work crew arrived on their train. They set to work immediately, just a few hundred feet from his house. He could see them clearly. They worked with a practiced efficiency. Men with long bars pried up the spikes. Others unbolted the angle bars. Then, a group of men would take hold of the rail with tongs, lift it on the count of 3, and carry it to the waiting flat car. It was the same motion he and his crew had used to lift the new rail, but now it was for a different purpose. They were lifting it to take it away forever. They worked their way closer. They passed the spot where the water tower had stood. The tower itself was gone now, taken down by a separate crew a few days ago. Only the concrete foundation remained, a small, square platform in the dirt. They reached the point directly in front of his house. He could see the faces of the men now, young faces mostly, strangers. One of them looked up and saw him sitting on the bench. The man's eyes met his for a moment, then looked away. There was no recognition, no connection. Cady was just an old man watching them work. They lifted the rail in front of his house. With a great heave, they carried it to the flat car. It slid onto the pile with a clang. Then they moved on to the next section. In an hour, the tracks in front of his house were gone. Where there had once been 2 parallel lines of steel, stretching to the horizon, there was now only a row of bare wooden ties, looking lost and purposeless on the gravel bed. Cady sat on the bench until the work train had moved on, disappearing around the curve to the east. He sat until the sun was high and the heat pressed down on him. He sat until Mary came out and touched his shoulder. "Come inside," she said. "It's too hot." He stood up slowly, his joints aching, and followed her into the house. He did not look back. The days that followed were formless. Without the railroad to structure his time, Cady drifted. He would wake up, eat, sit, go to bed. The silence was a physical presence, a weight on his chest. He would sometimes walk out to where the tracks used to be and stand on the bare ties. He would look east, then west. The line of ties continued in both directions, a ghost of the railroad, slowly being reclaimed by the desert. The creosote smell still clung to them, but it was fainter now, fading with each passing day. One afternoon, a wagon appeared on the old road that ran parallel to the tracks. It was a farm wagon, pulled by 2 mules. The driver was a man Cady did not know. He stopped the wagon near the house and climbed down. He was a stocky man with a red face and a bushy beard. "You Cady?" he asked. Cady nodded. "Name's Buckner. I bought this land. All of it. From the railroad." He gestured vaguely at the desert around them. "Gonna run some cattle. Maybe try to dry farm a little." He looked at Cady's house. "You'll need to be moving on. This property is part of the sale." Cady stared at him. The words took a moment to sink in. "This house," he said slowly. "It's not mine. It belongs to the railroad." Buckner nodded. "Was the railroad's. Now it's mine. And I need you off it. You got a week." He climbed back onto his wagon. "A week," he repeated. Then he flicked the reins, and the mule started forward, the wagon creaking and swaying as it continued down the old road. Cady watched him go. He felt nothing. No anger, no despair. Just a vast, empty numbness. He went inside and told Mary. She was sitting at the table, mending a sock. She listened, her needle never pausing. When he finished, she looked up. "We have a week," she said. "We should start packing." That was all. She folded the sock, put it in the mending basket, and stood up. She began to take plates down from the shelf and wrap them in an old cloth. Cady watched her for a moment, then he too began to move. He had no idea where they would go, or what they would do. But Mary was right. They had a week. They would pack. They would leave. The world of the railroad was gone. The world of Agua Fría was gone. There was only the present moment, and the small, practical tasks that filled it. They packed for 6 days. They sorted through a lifetime of possessions, keeping only what they could carry. Most of it they left behind, the heavy furniture, the extra pots and pans, the old clothes. On the 7th day, a wagon arrived. It was Buckner again, but this time he had come to help, not to evict. He helped them load their few belongings onto the wagon, a trunk of clothes, a box of kitchenware, the rocking chair, Cady's tools. Cady kept his spike maul, the one he had used for so many years. He couldn't leave it behind. It was a part of him. They climbed onto the wagon seat beside Buckner. Cady took one last look at the house. It was just a small, adobe building, but it had been his home for over 30 years. He looked at the spot where the tracks used to be, the long line of bare ties stretching into the distance. He looked at the foundation of the water tower, a square of concrete in the dirt. He looked at the vast, empty desert, unchanged and unchanging. Then he turned his face forward. "Where we going?" he asked Buckner. "Lammy," Buckner said. "There's a boarding house there. The railroad still runs through Lammy. Maybe you can find some work." Cady nodded. Lammy. It was the division point, the place where the old line met the new cutoff. It was a town he had only visited a few times, always for railroad business. Now it was to be his home. The wagon lurched forward, the mule straining against the weight. They moved slowly down the old road, away from Agua Fría. Cady did not look back again. He watched the road ahead, the dust rising in front of them, the mountains in the distance. Mary sat beside him, silent. The sun was warm on their backs. The wagon creaked and swayed. It was a new kind of journey, a new kind of movement, slow and uncertain, nothing like the smooth, predictable glide of a train on well-maintained rails. They reached Lammy late in the afternoon. It was a bustling place compared to Agua Fría. There was a large depot, a hotel, several stores, and houses scattered on the hillsides. Most importantly, there were tracks. Many tracks. They converged from different directions, carrying the endless flow of trains. The sound of whistles was constant, a background hum of activity. Cady stood on the depot platform, watching the trains come and go, listening to the clanging of bells and the hiss of steam. It was overwhelming after the silence of Agua Fría. Buckner helped them find the boarding house, a large, two-story wooden building near the depot. The landlady, a Mrs. Greeley, showed them to a small room on the second floor. It was clean but sparse, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small window that looked out onto the tracks. Cady stood at the window for a long time, watching the trains. He watched a passenger train glide in, disgorge its passengers, and glide out again. He watched a long freight train rumble through, its cars stretching for what seemed like miles. He watched the switch engines bustling back and forth, sorting cars, building new trains. It was a world of motion, a world he no longer belonged to. The first few weeks in Lamy were difficult. Cady felt lost, adrift. He had no routine, no purpose. He would walk the streets of the town, watching the bustle of activity, feeling like a ghost. He would go to the depot and sit on a bench, watching the trains. He would see the railroad men, the engineers and conductors and brakemen, striding purposefully about their business. They were part of it, part of the great machine. He was outside it now, a spectator. He tried to find work. He went to the roundhouse, the repair shop where locomotives were maintained. He spoke to the foreman, a man named O'Brien. O'Brien looked at his gnarled hands, his weathered face, his slow movements. "Sorry, old-timer," he said. "We need men who can move fast. Men who can climb. It's a young man's game." Cady nodded. He understood. He tried the freight depot, thinking he could load and unload boxes. But the work was too heavy, the pace too fast. He lasted half a day before the foreman told him not to come back. He tried the section gang, thinking his experience would be valuable. But the foreman was a young man, impatient, who ran his crew at a pace Cady could not match. "You're too slow, old man," the foreman said. "Sorry." For the first time in his life, Thomas Cady was useless. He had no function, no place. He sat in the boarding house room, looking out the window at the trains, and felt the days slip past him like water through his fingers. Mary found work, taking in laundry for some of the railroad families. She would leave early in the morning and return late in the afternoon, tired but satisfied. She was doing something. He was doing nothing. The inactivity gnawed at him. He would get up early, out of habit, and stand at the window, watching the first trains of the day. He would eat breakfast with Mary, then she would leave, and he would be alone. He would sit in the small room, or walk the streets, or sit on the depot bench. The hours stretched out, endless and empty. He began to feel like he was disappearing, fading into the background like an old photograph. One day, while sitting on his usual bench at the depot, he saw a familiar figure. It was a man in a flat-crowned felt hat and a blanket coat, walking along the platform. The man stopped and looked at him. It was Santiago. The silent Indian who had worked for him for those few weeks, so long ago. Santiago's face was the same, round and impassive, showing no surprise at seeing Cady. He walked over and sat down on the bench beside him. He didn't speak. They sat together in silence, watching the trains. After a long time, Santiago spoke. His voice was low and rough, as if unused. "I work here now," he said. "In the roundhouse. Cleaning the ash pits." Cady nodded. It was dirty, difficult work. "It is good work," Santiago added. Cady nodded again. They sat in silence for a while longer. Then Santiago stood up. "You were a good foreman," he said. He didn't look at Cady. He just said it, and then he walked away, disappearing into the crowd on the platform. Cady watched him go. The words stayed with him, a small warmth in the cold emptiness of his days. A good foreman. It was true. He had been a good foreman. He had known the track, known the work, known his men. He had taken pride in his section, kept it safe and true. That was something. That was real. That evening, he told Mary about seeing Santiago. She listened, stirring a pot of soup on the small stove in their room. "He remembered you," she said. "That's something." Cady nodded. "It is," he said. And for the first time in weeks, he felt a small flicker of something that might have been peace. The next day, he went back to the depot bench. But he didn't just sit and watch. He watched with a different eye. He watched the young men, the ones who moved so fast, and he saw them with a new understanding. They were just like him, once. They were learning the work, learning the railroad. They would make mistakes, and they would learn from them. They would get older, slower, and eventually, they too would be sitting on a bench somewhere, watching the trains go by. It was the way of things. It was the rhythm of the rails, a rhythm that was larger than any single man. Winter came to Lamy. It was colder than Agua Fría, the wind sweeping down from the mountains with a bitter edge. Cady spent more time in the boarding house room, sitting by the small stove, looking out the window. The trains still ran, their whistles muffled by the snow. He watched them, a constant stream of motion against the white landscape. He no longer felt the ache of loss when he saw them. They were just there, a part of the world, like the mountains and the sky. Mary continued her laundry work. She would come home in the evenings, her hands red and chapped, but she never complained. They would eat their supper together, sitting at the small table by the window, watching the last of the daylight fade. Their conversations were sparse, the comfortable silences of a long marriage filling the gaps. They talked about small things, the price of bread at the store, a letter from a niece back east, the antics of a stray cat that had taken to hanging around the boarding house. One evening, Mary looked at him across the table. "You're different," she said. It was not a question. He thought about it. Was he different? He felt different. The sharp edges of his grief had worn smooth, like stones tumbled in a stream. The loss of his work, his home, his world, it was still there, a part of him. But it no longer defined him. He was Thomas Cady, who had been a section foreman. He was also Mary's husband. He was a man who sat by a window and watched the trains. It was enough. "Yes," he said. "I suppose I am." She nodded, satisfied with the answer. She picked up her mending. He turned back to the window. A freight train was passing, its cars a blur of motion in the gathering dusk. He watched it until the last car disappeared from view, and then he watched the empty tracks, waiting for the next one. The days settled into a new rhythm, a gentle, undemanding rhythm. He would wake, eat, sit by the window. Sometimes he would walk to the depot and sit on the bench. Santiago would occasionally appear and sit with him for a while, not speaking, just sharing the silence. Other times, he would walk the streets of Lamy, observing the life of the town, a quiet spectator. He was no longer a part of the railroad, but he was still a part of the human current, flowing alongside it. Years passed. They passed slowly, in the way that years do when each day is much like the one before. Cady's hair turned completely white. His hands, though still gnarled, grew steadier. His steps, though slow, were sure. He became a familiar figure in Lamy, the old man who sat on the depot bench, the old man who watched the trains. The railroad men would nod to him as they passed, a gesture of respect for a man who had spent his life in their world. Mary continued her laundry work until her own hands grew too stiff. Then she stopped, and they lived on Cady's small railroad pension and the tiny amount they had saved. It was enough. They had few needs. The room in the boarding house was small but warm. Mrs. Greeley had long since passed, but her daughter had taken over and was happy to have them, quiet and reliable tenants who never caused any trouble. One spring morning, Cady was sitting on his bench at the depot. The sun was warm, the sky was a deep, cloudless blue. A train was coming in, a passenger train from the west. It glided to a stop at the platform, hissing and clanking. The passengers descended, a stream of people in their city clothes, heading for the hotel or for connecting trains. Cady watched them, as he always did. They were strangers, passing through, their lives touching his for a brief moment before moving on. Among the crowd, he saw a young man. He was tall and thin, with a puzzled look on his face. He was holding a piece of paper and looking around as if lost. He approached the bench where Cady sat. "Excuse me, sir," the young man said. "Can you tell me how to get to Agua Fría? I'm looking for a man named Thomas Cady. It says here he was the section foreman there." Cady looked at the young man for a long moment. He had kind eyes, this young man, and an earnest expression. "Why do you want to find him?" Cady asked. The young man smiled. "He's my grandfather. My mother was his daughter. She left home a long time ago, ran off with a traveling salesman. She never wrote, never came back. But she always talked about him, about Agua Fría. She passed away last year, and I promised myself I'd find him." Cady felt a strange sensation, a warmth spreading through his chest. A daughter. He had forgotten. It was so long ago, another lifetime. A girl of 16, headstrong and restless, who had argued with Mary and stormed out one night. They had never heard from her again. They had assumed she was dead, or that she wanted nothing to do with them. And now, here was her son, standing before him. "I'm Thomas Cady," he said. The young man's eyes widened. "You are? But Agua Fría? The railroad man told me it was abandoned." "There's nothing there." Cady nodded slowly. "There's nothing there," he agreed. "But I am here." He stood up, slowly, his old bones complaining. He looked at the young man, at his own flesh and blood, a connection to a past he had thought was lost forever. "Come," he said. "Your grandmother will want to meet you." They walked together, away from the depot, away from the trains, toward the boarding house. The young man talked, his voice full of questions and stories. Cady listened, walking slowly, feeling the sun on his face. Behind them, a locomotive whistled, a long, mournful sound that faded into the vast desert sky. But Cady did not turn around. He was walking towards something new, something he had never expected to find. And for the first time in a very long time, the silence that followed the train's whistle did not feel empty. It felt, instead, like a beginning.